Necronomicon, Herbert West, Reanimator, 6. The Tome Legions. When Dr. Herbert West disappeared a year ago, the Boston police questioned me closely. They suspected that I was holding something back and perhaps suspected even graver things, but I could not tell them the truth because they would not have believed it. They knew indeed that West had been connected with activities beyond the credence of ordinary men, or his hideous experience in the reanimation of dead bodies had long been too extensive to admit of perfect secrecy, but the final soul-shattering catastrophe held elements of demonic fantasy which make even me doubt the reality of what I saw. I was West's closest friend and only confidential assistant. We had met years before in medical school, and from the first I had shared his terrible researches. He had slowly tried to perfect a solution which injected into the veins of newly deceased would restore life, a labor demanding an abundance of fresh corpses, and therefore involving the most unnatural actions. Still more shocking were the products of some of the experiments, grisly masses of flesh that had been dead, but that West waked to a blind, brainless, nauseous animation. These were the usual results, for in order to reawaken the mind, it was necessary to have specimens so absolutely fresh that no decay could possibly affect the delicate brain cells. This need for very fresh corpses had been West's moral undoing. They were hard to get, and one awful day he had secured his specimen while it was still alive and vigorous. The struggle, a needle, and a powerful alkaloid had transformed it into a very fresh corpse, and the experience had succeeded for a brief memorable moment. But West had emerged with a soul collapsed and seared and a hardened eye, which sometimes glanced with a kind of hideous and calculating appraisal at men of especially sensitive brain and especially vigorous physique. Toward the last, I became acutely afraid of West, for he began to look at me that way. People did not seem to notice his glasses, but they noticed my fear, and after his disappearance used that as a basis for some absurd suspicions. West, in reality, was more afraid than I, for his abominable pursuits entailed a life of fugitiveness and dread of every shadow. Hardly it was the police he feared, but sometimes his nervousness was deeper and more nebulous, touching on certain indescribable things into which he had injected a morbid life, and from which he had not seen that life depart. He usually finished his experience with a revolver, but a few times he had not been quick enough. There was the first specimen on whose rifle grave marks of clawing were later seen. There was also that Arkham professor's body, which had done cannibal things before it had been captured and thrust unidentified into a madhouse cell at Saffron, where it beat the walls for 16 years. Most of the other possible surviving results were things less easy to speak of, for in later years, West's scientific zeal had degenerated into an unhealthy and fantastic mania, and had spent his chief skill in vitalizing not entire human bodies, but isolated parts of bodies, or parts of joint organic matter other than human. It had become fiendishly disgusting by the time he disappeared. Many of the experiments could not even be hinted at in print. The great war of the experiments could not even, though which both of us served as surgeons, had intensified the side of West. In saying that West's fear of his specimens was nebulous, I have in mind particularly of its complex nature. Part of it came merely from knowing of the existence of such nameless monsters, while another part arose from the apprehension of bodily harm they might under certain circumstances do him. Their disappearance added horror to the situation of them all. West knew the whereabouts of only one, the pitful asylum thing. Then there was a more subtle fear, a very fantastic sensation resulting from a curious experiment in the Canadian Army in 1915. West, in the midst of a severe battle, had reanimated Major Sir Eric Moreland Clapham to lead, DSO, a fellow physician who knew about his experiments and could have duplicated them. The head had been removed so that the possibilities of the quasi solution life in the trunk might be investigated. Just as the building was wiped out by a German shell, there had been a success. The trunk had moved intelligently and unbelievably to relate. We both singularly sure that the articulate sounds had come from the detached head as it lay in a shadowy corner of the laboratory. The shell had been merciful in a way that West could never feel as certain as he wished that he were too the only survivors. He used to make the shuddering conjectures about the possible actions of a headless physician with the power of reanimating the dead. West's last quarters were in a veritable house of much eloquence, overlooking one of the oldest burying grounds in Boston. He had chosen the place for purely symbolic and fantastically aesthetic reasons, since most of the internments were of a colonial period, and therefore of a little use as scientists seeking very fresh bodies. The laboratory was in a subcellar secretly constructed by imported workmen, and it contained a huge incinerator for the quiet and complete disposal of such bodies, or fragments and synthetic mockeries of bodies, as might remain from the morbid experiments and unfollowed amusements of the owner. During the excavation of this cellar, the workmen had struck some exceedingly ancient masonry, undoubtedly connected with the old burying ground, yet far too deep to correspond with any known sepulchre therein. After a number of calculations, was decided that it represented some secret chamber beneath the tomb of the Averiles, where the last interment had been made in 1768. I was with him when he studied the mattress-dripping walls laid bare by the spades and the toxic men, and had prepared for the gruesome thrill which would attend the uncovering of centrified grave secrets. But for the first time, West knew timidly conquered his natural curiosity. He betrayed his degenerating fiber by ordering the masonry left intact and plastered over. Thus it remained till that final hellish night far for the walls of the secret laboratory. I speak of West's decadence, but must add that it is purely mental and intangible thing. Outwardly, he was the same to the last, calm, cold as light, yellow-haired, with spectacled blue eyes and a general aspect of youth, which years and years seemed never to change. He seemed calm even when he thought of that clawed grave, and looked at his shoulder, even as he thought of the carnivorous thing that gnawed him upon at Sefton Bars. The end of Herbert West began one evening in our joint study, when he was dividing his curious glance between the newspaper and me. A strange headline item had struck at him from the crumpled pages, and a nameless Tyson plot had seemed to reach down through 16 years. Something fearsome and incredible had happened at Sefton Asylum, 50 miles away, stunning the neighborhood and baffling the police. In the small hours of the morning, a body of silent men had entered the grounds, and their leader had aroused the attendants, and he was menacing with a military figure who talked about moving his lips, and whose voice seemed almost ventriloquially connected with an immense black case he carried. His expressionless face was handsome to the point of radiant beauty, but had shocked the superintendent when the whole light fell on it, for it was a wax face with eyes of painted glass. Some nameless accident had befallen this man. A larger man guided his steps. Melody, the speaker, had asked for the custody of the cannibal monster committed from Arkham 16 years before, and upon being refused, gave a signal which precipitated a shocking riot. The fiends had beaten, trampled, and bitten every attendant who died not flee, killing 4 and finally succeeding in the liberation of the monster. These victims, who could recall the event about hysteria, swore that the creatures had acted less like men than like unthinkable automata, readed by the wax-faced leader. By the time help could be summoned, every trace of the men and their mad charge had vanished. From hour of reading this item until midnight, West sat, almost paralyzed. At midnight, the dormant brain, starting him startling him fearfully. All the servants were asleep in the attic, so I answered the bell, as I told the police, where there was no wagon in the street, but only a group of strange-looking figures bearing grunted and highly unnatural voice. The express prepaid. They filled out the house with a jerky tread, and I watched them go. I had an old idea that they were turning towards the ancient cemetery. I wished the back of the door abutted. When I slammed the door after them, West came downstairs and lifted the box. It was about 2 feet square and bore West's correct name and present address. It also bore the inscription from Eric Morland, Clapham Lee, St. Illinois, Flanders. 60 years before in Flanders, Shell Hospital had fallen upon the headless reanimated trunk of Dr. Clapham Lee, and upon the detached head, which perhaps had uttered articulate sounds. West was not even excited now. His condition was more ghastly. Quickly, he said, "It's the finish, but let's incinerate to this." We carried the thing down to the laboratory. Listening, I do not remember many particulars. You can imagine my state of mind, but it is a vicious lie to say it was Herbert West's body, which I put into the incinerator. We both inserted the whole unopened box, closed the door, and started electricity. Nor did any sound come from the box after all. It was West who first noticed the falling plaster on the part of the wall where the ancient stone masonry had been covered up. I was going to run, but he stopped me, and I saw a small black aperture, felt a ghoulish wind of ice, and smelled the charnel bowels of the putrescent earth. There was no sound, but just the electric lights went out, and I saw the outline against which some phosphorescence of the netherworld, a horde of silent, toiling things, which only insanity or worse could create. Their outlines were human, semi-human, fractionally human, and not human at all. The horde was grotesquely heterogeneous. They were removing the stones quietly, one by one, from the centered wall, and then had the breach became large enough. They came out into the laboratory in a single file, led by a stalking thing with a beautiful head made of wax. The sort of mad-eyed monstrosity behind the leader seized as Herbert West. West did not resist or utter a sound. Then they all sprang at him and tore him to pieces before my eyes, bearing the fragments away into the subterranean vault of the fabulous abominations. West's head was carried off by the wax-headed leader, who wore a Canadian officer's uniform. As it disappeared, I saw the blue eyes behind the spectacles were hideously blazing with their first touch of frantic, visible emotion. Servants found me unconscious in the morning. West was gone. The incinerator contained only unidentifiable ashes. Detectives had questioned me, but what can I say? The Septon tragedy, they will not connect with West, nor that, nor the men with the box whose existence they denied. I told them of the vault, and they pointed to unbroken plaster wall and laughed. So I told them no more. They implied I am either a madman or a murderer. Probably I am mad, but I might not be mad if those accused tome legions had not been so silent.